We'll get going. So thank you everyone coming to Dual Use Solar. I'm really excited about this talk today. And I wanted to introduce our two speakers. We have Jesse Robertson-DuBois, and we also have Ian Ward. I'm going to let them introduce themselves and then we'll get going.
Sure. Thanks, Susan. I am a farmer and farmland protection guy, sort of my professional background long before I got involved with solar. Currently the director of sustainable solar development with BlueWave Solar, which is a Massachusetts-based solar developer focusing on agrivoltaics. And in my private life, my wife and I run Finicky Farm out in Northfield, Massachusetts. We graze in solar arrays, and we are looking forward to continuing to grow our farming and solar activities.
And I'm Ian Ward, Solar Agricultural Services, SOLAG. I've got some slides that sort of show a background as a farmer and longtime farmer advocate, land conservation, and NRCS technical service provider for conservation plans. I'll kick it back to Jesse.
All right. Thanks, Ian. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I will start with our presentation. So first, just a little bit of background. Oh, didn't. Right. Is that working for everybody?
Yes.
Perfect. First, just a little bit of background on BlueWave. We were founded in 2011. Our mission is to revolutionize energy with simple, powerful solar and storage solutions with the goal of protecting the planet by transforming access to renewable energy. And I should say we are Massachusetts-based, a lot of history in Massachusetts, but we had a recent capital raise, partnered with a Canadian infrastructure group, and we are now expanding nationwide. And the really exciting thing about that from an agrivoltaic perspective is that we will be able to be the long-term owners of the agrivoltaic systems that we're developing from here forward. So we're building relationships with farmers and with landowners that will probably outlast everybody involved, or at least everybody except for our younger staff. So that's very exciting. A little more just background on solar terminology. There's a lot of language out there on various things. When I use agrivoltaics, I'm really talking about the subset of agricultural and photovoltaic systems that are intended to produce farm products, whether that's livestock, whether that's crops, pasture, in addition to producing solar energy. There are also dual use projects involving conservation outcomes. We're working on a project in Maine providing habitat for black racer snakes. There are pollinator habitat perspectives. If it's a honey producing pollinator habitat, I would call it agrivoltaics. If it's wild pollinators, I would call it an awesome thing to do, but not agrivoltaics, just a form of dual use. What I'm going to really focus on today is dual use agrivoltaics that either fit agriculture within a fairly standard solar system like sheep grazing, or adaptive agrivoltaics, which is what I call the types of systems that have for a couple of years now been possible to build in Massachusetts with an incentive for modifying the solar system to allow more types of agricultural operation. So that's really sort of the focus. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the sort of larger scale agricultural, ag-ready agrivoltaics. We're working on that in New York and Pennsylvania and sort of larger big ag states. If you want to talk about how to fit combines in the solar array, we can do that. But there's not a lot of call for it here in Massachusetts. So just to start on dual use, these are pictures that I took as part of our grazing operation. These are my personal family sheep, and that's our walk behind hay mower and round baler and rake in the upper right picture. We, for 2 years now, have been grazing and producing hay inside conventional solar arrays. These are all solar arrays that were designed for solar first. There was no intent that they would be farmed. And we are basically doing it as a vegetation management activity and as an agricultural activity. So the reason I like to include these slides is really to show the diversity of species that you can have inside a solar array, without having planted anything in particular for pollinators. If you have good soils, and those soils were managed well during construction, you can really have a lot of forage productivity and a very diverse landscape inside that array. And productive. We were able to, I took these pictures showing haying along the edges of the array, but we're able to make hay in between the rows of conventional solar panels as well. It's more challenging to dry. I wouldn't say it isn't. But it's a question of how many good hay windows are there in a season inside a conventional solar array versus in an open field production system. And it's a question of what is the scale and the efficiency of the equipment that you can physically fit inside the system. This obviously isn't terribly efficient equipment, but it works very well for us to be able to take forage back to the farm for winter feed while also grazing underneath the panels during the summer. So we'll typically hay first and then bring the sheep in to graze underneath the panels. But this is a way that for our family, not owning land and not coming from a sort of inherited agricultural background, this is a way we could access a lot more land than we otherwise can afford. As a business model, the way you need to think about dual use grazing is it's a logistics and landscaping business. There are shepherds out there who do grazing services only, and they don't weed whack around panels. They don't take care of the landscaping out front. But we've chosen, if we're going to drive to where the solar arrays that we're working in are, we do comprehensive vegetation management. Going out there to check on the sheep anyway, we might as well to bring a weed whacker and weed whack around the landscape plantings out front, around the fences, around the equipment pads, that kind of thing. For us, it's let us go to, almost 90 acres this past year, starting from just 2 arrays with 25 acres. We're up to 6 arrays. This coming year will be around 175 acres. We are getting asked by more companies and asked by the same companies to take on more. It's really a question of being able to afford to buy more ewes. I don't know if any of you have priced ewes lately, but the sheep market is a little crazy. And we would rather grow with our own stock. So we're sort of growing slowly and taking on arrays as we can, and then trying to leverage that by making hay inside solar arrays. If anybody is interested, I absolutely check out the American Solar Grazing Association. I'm on the advisory board. A lot of really good folks and grazers all over the country are a part of ASGA. There's a real wealth of information on that website. A little bit of background, and this is, so the 2 arrays that you see here are the 2 arrays we started with in 2021. These are in Fitchburg. They were not designed with agriculture in mind. And if you look at the pictures closely, you can see that these were old orchards. One landowner, one family that owned it. And the upper right picture, you see the first of the non-farm houses going into the orchards. By the lower right picture, you see a bunch more houses landed in the orchard that isn't now a solar array. What you can't see as well probably is that in that smaller right array, that entire field was orchard. And for the landowner, they were facing a decision where they couldn't get labor to continue orcharding. The market for apples stank, and they just didn't see a path forward. I included the picture of the house. That's not actually the landowner's house, but it's one of his neighbors who was also in the orchard business. And like a lot of older farms, they were just like, you couldn't keep up. They were losing the farm. They would lose the land unless they did something different. For the landowner, he didn't want to lose the land. He didn't want to give it up. But who can pay to take out a full-scale orchard of full-size traditional standard apple trees? It's an incredibly expensive proposition, and the orchard was getting overrun with bittersweet and other invasives. So for him, he looked at solar as a way of getting out of the orchard business without letting the whole orchard turn into scrub forest or selling the rest of it for houses. And that's what these 2 arrays did. The smaller array, the rest of that field is a hay field, and he uses the hay for his own livestock that he has. And then the larger array is entirely a solar array. But 30 years from now, his heirs will get that land back as open fields without reverting to forest and without losing the rest of the land to houses. The most important thing to keep in mind is that these are decisions made by families and by landowners as a way of buying time. There are probably very few folks among the landowner community involved in solar who are coming to solar out of a just absolute passion to do solar. Mostly they would prefer to stay in agriculture, but they haven't been able to find a way to do that. And this is a way for them to keep that land and pass it down to the next generation. And this is what we get at. You know, the thing that I keep driving home to people is if you've never been inside a solar array, it's really hard to understand at just a basic level how productive solar land can be. You know, this past year, grazing in these arrays and the other arrays we grazed in absolutely saved us. We had better forage inside those solar arrays than we did on open pastures. It was really dry. These were the arrays. This was the acres that kept our animals well fed and happy. And to be honest, on these arrays in particular, I don't know that I can see a difference walking around out there, looking at the ground, looking at pastures. And I've been looking at pastures for over 20 years. I don't know that I can see the difference between what solar is doing to that land versus what just management would do to that land. What I'm trying to say is the margin of productivity that is impacted by solar, I think, is smaller than the margin of impact on productivity from agricultural management. We all know plenty of farms that aren't managed terribly well. We all probably know a few farms that are managed exceptionally well. That range is a whole lot bigger than the range that solar creates, so far as I can tell, walking around inside dozens of arrays. So to focus a little more on the next phase, the sort of cropping systems that you can do if you start adapting the agricultural methods. The big things are, what do you have for equipment and what crops are we talking about? So the more appropriate crops are going to be the things that are shade tolerant, leafy, roots and shoots. You're going to stay away from the really light loving crops. The more challenging things, even more so than shade tolerance, is probably how mechanized are the crops? How tall are they? As a farmer, what are the economics, the operational economics of getting that crop in the ground, getting it cultivated, getting harvested, getting it out of the field? If that's something you can do with smaller equipment, you probably can figure out a way to do it inside a solar array. If that's something that you need really big equipment, it's going to be that much more challenging. The other thing I like about these pictures is these are all systems that were built in Europe. They're all sort of research scale systems, 1 to 2 megawatts. We do not have systems like this in the US, and we are not likely to get systems like this anytime soon. They are not commercially available at a scale that the way the solar market works in the US is really buildable. You can't get financing for them. You can't, in some cases, get the engineering. Most of them aren't certified to pass the underwriters laboratories certification process for installing as electrical equipment. Trust me, we've put a lot of effort into trying to get these systems and figure out how to install them. The simple answer is not unless the market is a whole lot bigger than it currently is. So what can we do with the systems we do have in the US? First, just a little about crops. I include this slide not to go into the details of all of these crops, but if you look at, this is basically the light saturation points and the compensation points, the points at which a crop starts photosynthesizing in response to light, and then when it maxes out and the addition of more light won't create more productivity. That light saturation point, where it maxes out, can range from 30% of natural daylight to around 80 or 90% of natural daylight. Corn is one of the top crops. It really likes a lot of sun. There's a lot of stuff in the 60, 70, 50, 40% of daylight saturation point range that is shade tolerant enough to really do very well in a solar system. And the thing that I highlight here is if you look on that right-hand column, those are dates for the research papers that establish light saturation points. This isn't new research. This isn't something that we need more research into. These are decades old scientific knowledge about the light saturation points of crops. What we don't have good data on is how do you make the ag economics work inside a particular set of equipment? And that's something that's incredibly hard to research. Similarly, with forage crops, you can see there are a lot of forage crops that can perform at the 80, 90, even better than 100% productivity in the summertime during summer slump inside a partially shaded system. There's a lot more research into pasture and forage-based systems because of the interest in silviculture and silvopasture. Again, the point here is not that we don't have crops that will produce well inside a solar system, but how do we design a system that will allow the operational economics to be successful? BlueWave's approach to this, and we worked with the Mass Department of Ag and Mass DOER to develop this tool. And this is the dual use shading analysis tool that we developed with some DOER money to allow you to iterate different versions of a system design and see what the impacts in terms of shading are on the ground level. So this is modeling, in this example, a traditional south-facing fixed tilt array, 2 modules in portrait. So 2 solar panels in portrait format like this, tall from the drip edge up to the upper edge. What you can really see here is you have a very deep shade level. The shade level here is over 90%. I think it's 96. Yeah, 96%. The more important thing from an agricultural perspective is because it's south-facing, that shade level is out of line with the system structural elements. In other words, the aisle in between 2 rows of arrays is partially heavily shaded and partially in full sun. From an agricultural perspective, that makes it challenging to operate at an efficient scale because essentially you have 2 different crop zones that you have to manage independently inside the area that you can get at with a tractor. When you look at a system that instead of is south-facing, you turn it 90 degrees and use what's called a single axis tracker. That's a tracker that faces east in the morning, straight up at noon, and then west in the afternoon. It's not changing its angle based on the seasons, but it's just changing over the course of the day, following the sun from east to west. What you get with that north-south facing rows is a lot more even distribution of light. And so by modeling where that shade will land at every hour during the day, we can really get a sense for how much more consistent that light pattern is. On the left in this slide, you see a 1P, 1 module in portrait, single axis tracker, about 46% maximum shade level directly underneath the trackers. The system on the bottom is a 2 modules in portrait. These are both designed for about the same solar capacity per acre, but one is 1 portrait and the lower one is 2 portrait with a much wider row spacing. Same number of panels per acre, but more room in between the rows and denser shade directly underneath the panels. What that gets us to is 40 feet from panel edge to panel edge. A lot of room for cropping inside that system without giving up any solar productivity. What we also get is almost 70% shade directly under that system. And this type of system wouldn't be allowed in the Massachusetts agrivoltaics program because it exceeds 50% shade. And we've tried to do that, tried to get permission for that. And as yet, we have not been able to. But when I look at this as a farmer, and particularly as somebody who is thinking about cropping both forage and vegetable crops inside a system, I would much rather have 40 feet between those panels than to only have 20 feet in between those panels. It would be a heck of a lot easier to not just farm, but to farm efficiently. These are sort of the design challenges, trade-offs that we face. This is an example in the field of one of those 1 portrait tracker systems. So you can see there's a panel mounted crosswise across the torque tube. That torque tube rotates east to west. This is a system that was installed in Munson. It's not a BlueWave system, but it is an Array Technologies, an ATI system, which we are also using. One of the downsides to the ATI system is there's a horizontal drive line about 7 feet off the ground. So that's going to limit what type of agricultural equipment you can get in there unless the solar company is willing to let the farmer remove the drive line, set it aside, do work, and reinstall the drive line. And that's the strategy we're using with these. This is an example of one of those larger 2 portrait systems that is taller, deeper shade underneath. But as you can see, there's still a lot of sun underneath there. I'm really hopeful one day we'll get the state program in Massachusetts to let us use these because the benefits for agriculture are just really, really apparent when you look at the system. But frankly, the politics of agrivoltaics in Massachusetts have been so problematic that I think MDAR is just really, to be candid, gun shy of trying to approve something that somebody will criticize as being too shady. From my perspective, I'm not worried about shade where there are structural posts coming out of the ground because I can't drive a tractor there. My sheep can clean up in the shade just as fine, but I can't make hay where there are posts. So I'd much rather have more row spacing and deeper shade underneath. The sheep like the shade anyway. This is an example of a schematic showing some of the impact of height. I developed this as part of the Pine Meadow projects in Northfield. I wanted to show what a self-propelled forage harvester would look like. So that's a Heston 8200. It's a mid-90s diesel sickle bar mower conditioner with a 12-foot cutter bar. With the 12-foot system, that orange circle, that's sort of showing the rotation of the panels, we can cruise right through that system without worrying about the panels at all. Basically, as long as we don't run into posts, we'll be fine in there. If we were to use a standard height version of the same system, we would have to be really careful about which way the panels are tilting, or we would have to lock them in a horizontal position or lock them away from each row we're working in. That's something you can do with the solar controls. But again, it's something that Massachusetts has decided not to allow. Basically, it won't count to use those kind of tracker controls as part of the agrivoltaic system. They want us to put the panels up high and to keep it to no more than 50% shade, just across the board, no matter what. What that does is it drives the costs up and it makes it much harder to come up with viable systems. The real risk with a short system, from my perspective for cropping, is much less about getting the equipment in and out. It's much more about whether the crop will shade the equipment. Corn is a problem, not because the tracker is going to prevent the corn from growing, but because the corn is going to shade the tracker and prevent it from producing electricity. We'll see. In other states, we are developing these kinds of systems with a little more flexibility, and I'm really excited to see how they perform in an agricultural context. And I know I'm running long, Ian, and I don't actually have 33 slides. I've just got a couple more, but I wanted to show the layout of what BlueWave's strategy is in terms of agrivoltaics, because at the end of the day, most solar arrays are a field scale. They're 5 acres, 10 acres, maybe 20 acres. But they're not a scale that a farm can really build a whole farm operation around. You have to cobble together a bunch of solar arrays if you want to focus on agrivoltaics. BlueWave has taken the strategy of focusing on assemblages wherever we can in order to allow farmers to really double down and focus on the agrivoltaics and do a really good job of it. So this is the Northfield assemblage that people may have heard about. It's been in the press. It's been talked about a lot. It's sort of held out there as a boogeyman. Be about 70 acres of land in single axis tracker arrays. And I'll be the farmer there if this ever comes through. The scale here is driven by what makes it agriculturally viable and what the utility interconnection requires. We got a lot of flack and people have really criticized the projects for being focused on sheep grazing. The fact is that was the thing that UMass was comfortable saying they knew would work. They weren't comfortable saying that forage harvesting would work. From my perspective as a farmer, that's my winter feed source. It's all forage harvesting. The sheep will just go in there to clean up around the posts. We've got plenty of land in conventional solar arrays all over Massachusetts. We don't need to do sheep grazing inside high clearance, widely spaced agrivoltaic arrays. It's just silly. It's great land for making forage, and that's what we're going to do in there. Just a little more context. That's what it looks like on the ground. We're renting the rest of those green highlighted areas for our sheep herd primarily, for our goat herd, because we don't put our goats into the conventional solar arrays because they'll chew on the wires. And that barn is the barn 1.5 miles up the road. It's the former dairy barn that all of the neighbors' houses were built on land from that dairy. And now they don't want to see us continue using the land for agriculture because they don't want to look at the solar panels as a part of it. Really, this kind of situation is about transitions in management and transitions from one generation to another. And that's what the Latoile family and my family were trying to accomplish with this, and what BlueWave stepped in to try to make possible is that long intergenerational transition in farm management. The last slide I want to show you is one of the real specialty things that we've heard a lot about, and I think probably we will start to see in the United States. It's a vertical bifacial system. This is an example of a system from Germany, but people really like it because the panels are entirely out of the way and they don't throw any shade on the ground because they're facing straight up. The problem is you still have posts. And if I was the operator of that tractor in the upper left, that's a forage harvester, a triple mower. There's a mower up in front of the tractor and 2 mowers out to either side, mowing probably 30 to 40 feet wide at a single pass. If I was in there, I would be worrying about how many gears of operating speed do I lose to fit down that aisle? If I could go a couple feet wider and have the panels rotating up top, I wouldn't worry about that at all. And I would be thrilled to drive a little faster. In here, you're still going to have about the same harvestable area as you would have with the single axis tracker system. You just get a lot less photovoltaic production. And so it's a lot harder to finance. That's it. Ian, I'm going to let you take it from there. I can just stop.
All right. Thank you, Jesse. Man, that's such good information. I hope all of you that were listening were seeing the big picture, because that is the important element of this is seeing the big picture as agrivoltaics, ag PV is becoming something, and it's something of a discussion point. And that's kind of where I wanted to jump in and start sharing my screen. Can you all see this? All right. So I think the important thing is, as I was mentioning, to me, the important thing is the why, right? So, you know, we have really high caliber people thinking about agrivoltaics. As Jesse is showing, BlueWave is all in on this. My perspective as a systems thinker, that's what I went to school for at the University of New Hampshire, left college, went out to Montana to actually learn how to build log homes and use resources that were regenerative and in the logging space. And you know, that's me as a 21-year-old with the crew. And the thing that was most remarkable about that experience was when you ask these guys, these are 4th, 5th generation Montanans, you ask them, look, what can I do to help the environment? I came out here to learn. They basically said to go home. Go home and tell your armchair professors to leave us alone. We're managing this land just fine. Thank you very much. And that was something, wow, I was like, well, that wasn't what I was expecting, but it made an impression. And if you can make decisions knowing, like Wes Jackson of the Land Institute, you know, becoming native to this place, if you can make decisions thinking of that place, thinking of the land first, then overall, we're all better off. So part of my story is having that experience, coming back, thinking, geez, I really want to figure out how to farm myself. I got started a business, a consulting company, and while I was doing that, I was trying to find land. The Soul Homestead here. I'm from Middleborough, Massachusetts. That's why CMAP is near and dear to my heart. And what I realized quickly was, you know, the land preservation and farming as a result were kind of, they were not synonymous. I was trying to find farms. I tried to buy 2 farms. This first one over here, with showing house lot number 7, was right across the street from the Soul Homestead. Tried to buy that. It became a house. Another farm down the road on Tispin Street I had a person sale. We were going to go, and I could not get financing in time. Developer came in, and you know, just like a lot of agricultural lands, it went the way of the only thing left on that farm is the word silo in the name of the road. So where do you go from there? I decided instead of trying to compete with developers, I would buy a wetland. So you didn't have to compete with a house we put on a wetland. So I bought a cranberry bog. These are my boys here, now 17 and 18, but I'm just going to show you that you know, where there's a will, there's a way. And cranberries was a vehicle to do agriculture for me as I was expanding the backland, putting fences, producing cows and chickens and sheep and hogs. And at the same time, working with NRCS as a conservation planner, and started New England Consulting Services, involved with the Palmer River Initiative, Watershed Initiative, and really doing conservation planning and sort of engaged in anything that helped farmers stay farming. That was our motto, keeping farmers farming and farmland farmable. The SMART program came about, and we decided, hey, we still have New England Consulting Services. We've got the credentials there on conservation planning, but what can we do to enhance the ability for agrivoltaics to happen? Ag PV, agriculture, photovoltaics, agrivoltaics is the word. Just simply, can we grow crops on our solar panels? It seemed to me that we could. And personally, I didn't want to see the projected 6 to 10 million acres of land that the US is looking to go to solar development in the next 10 or 15 years be fenced off and be excluded from use by farmers. So that was why I got involved with dual use agrivoltaics, working in close partnership with BlueWave and others, implementing. And the key here is in Massachusetts, particularly, 90 acres on our first farms, 18 megawatts, 90 acres, 6 farms. We've got also permitted 42 megawatts, 240 acres on 14 farms. We're not talking about massive amounts of farmland yet. And we are talking about lots of different farmers that are benefiting. And one of the key elements here is there is a difference, and the thought process here, and thinking about this regeneratively, is a landowner can be different from the farmer. You can own agricultural land and be the farmer, or you can have a tenant farmer. And the way that we're looking to structure these in Massachusetts, which really allows for opportunity, is there's a lease payment to the landowner, and there's an agricultural payment or a vegetation management payment to the farmer. Because as Jesse was showing, these panels require vegetation management so that grasses and vegetation doesn't grow up. That could be in the form of grass, pollinator habitat. That can be in the form of pasture. That can be in the form of row crops. And I'll show you some of the pictures of projects that we have to put that in place. This is one of them. This is the BlueWave project up in Maine. In this case, this was not a designed project from the start looking at agrivoltaics. This was a conventional array where there's nothing special done, except it was going over blueberry fields. And we said, well, why not see what the impact of shade and growing conditions and fertilizing and the microclimate that panels create, why not see what the impact might be on blueberries? So the University of Maine this is a BlueWave permitted project that is now owned by Navasun. Working with the University of Maine, we have a SARE grant, and it's a 4-year study showing what the impact of low impact construction with mats. That's like very low impact. Other areas of the array were not using mats, but just with straight on, straight off tracked machines. And another part of the array was done without much regard for the underlying plants. And we're getting results. We're getting the latest results just came out, and it was talked about this past yesterday. So these are things that we're actively engaged, that the solar industry is actively engaged in studying. Here's some examples of crops that are grown, vegetable crops. This is Jack's solar garden out in Colorado. And he's got a 6-foot high array, so not conventional, a little higher than conventional, but single axis tracker, as Jesse was talking about. You can see the irrigation that they have there, and there's University of Arizona and Colorado State are researching the productivity of the vegetables under this array. And in Massachusetts here, we had the MDAR did change their policy, but prior to them changing their policy, there was land that was abandoned farmland, sand pits that were not agriculturally productive. There's still land and ag use, but sort of spent sand pits or areas where material was stored. So why can't we make that productive agricultural land? How do you do that? Well, in this case, we use a machine that's a reverse tiller that they use on the mountainsides of Vermont, because the Forest Service, loves that there's no erosion coming from that. We spread lime. We incorporated that with a nice fluffy 10 to 12 inch non-compacted seed bed. And after we did that, we said, let's put the carbon back into the soil, carbon that was harvested from the trees that were around the sand pit. So let's mulch those up and put those back on the soil as an experiment to see what happens if you sort of lessen the compaction. That mulch was a layer that machines could travel over without. The idea was to limit the amount of compaction in the soil to begin with. And then as that was put into the soil through tires traveling over it, it would be a good way to get the mycorrhizal function of that soil working again. This is a month and a half later, looking at the cover crop, 12 different species of cover crop that was planted out there. Again, the idea being, let's think about this regeneratively. How do we get the soil working again in preparation for the compaction that would happen with the panels? This is the construction just finished. This is the day after construction finished. So you can see that the site is, those chips, the mulch was put into that soil. It did, for the most part, keep erosion to a minimum. There's a little bit. But this is an example too. This actually was a swale that was put in underneath that drive shaft so that we could maintain 10-foot of clearance with tractors going underneath. This is another shot of that. This is adjacent to Cranberry Bog. And this is right after the machine that you saw originally planted. You see the cover crop just coming up. This was 2 weeks after the cover crop was planted. Here's an example of a project that another one that BlueWave did that is now owned by AES in Grafton. And this is just to illustrate, this is a fixed tilt array raised up a minimum of 8 feet off the ground, single axis trackers at the T or 10 feet off the ground. This is to illustrate that larger machinery can fit underneath here. A lot of questions come up with farmers when they look at this is, geez, will things grow? What can I grow and what equipment can I use? Does my existing equipment work? And we go through great lengths of measuring the existing equipment, determining what boom sprayers could be used, could be retrofitted. And ultimately, we're Yankees. We can figure out how to do farming under these panels. This is another example of the harrow working. Lessons learned. We learned that rock pick, as you are over rocky soils, and you're compacting this with machinery when you're building the panels, you got a rock pick. Going forward, that machine that we showed, it was a reverse tiller, that can take these rocks and mince them up to basically dust and incorporate those minerals back into the soil. Here's an example of a planter. This is this project is engaged with the University of Massachusetts and American Farmland Trust. All in the impetus was, let's study what the impact of shade could be on the crop. Let's look at what happens under the panel. Let's look at what happens in the middle of the row. Let's look at what happens on the far side. So we have 4 rows of crops. We're looking at leafy greens and squash. We also have a livestock array that we're doing studies with. Here's the leafy greens that were planted. This is the livestock fence that was put around, and this is the opportunity, right? At the end of the day, why am I passionate about the opportunities that agrivoltaics creates? It really lowers the barrier of entry for new farmers, beginning farmers, the BIPOC community. You figure if this land, again, we're separating the land lease from the farming vegetation management payment. If there is an interest, and there is, with beginning farmers and the BIPOC community to come to a site that's prepared, it's fenced. This is an 8-foot tall fence. It keeps the deer out as much as it keeps other livestock in. You can do both. There's a well on site, and I'll go to the well. Here's the electrical work that's happening. Here's the well that was put in, that was funded as part of the capital expenditures involved with the upfront solar installation. So we've got a water supply that was not otherwise there. We have irrigation going out to the site. We have sensors now showing that what the influence of sunlight is. It's not about the shade. It's about photosynthetically available active radiation. And that diffuse light is actually probably, for a lot of species, better than direct sunlight, especially in light of some of the drought conditions that we're seeing of late. So wanted to show how much research is actually being done by the University of Massachusetts, Cornell, Rutgers University just got a grant to study down in New Jersey, some of the similar projects. And when we're talking about agricultural infrastructure, fencing a well, a shelter provided for the animals, and a heavy use area made to specifications of NRCS. We're incorporating all those things in these projects. Here are the cows on the other side of the array grazing. And here's that cover crop that was planted on this array. This is what those cows were eating. This is the project from looking down on top. You can see this area over here is the heavy use area. You're looking at the vantage point from here, looking back at the shelter. The cows have free roam. We're using portable electric fencing to do holistic grazing on this site. This is another site. This is over Cranberry Bog. There was a project that was put forth. There was poles were switched out, but this is a project that is something that UMass is also studying with the impact of sunlight, the impact of soil compaction. These are installed on mats to keep the low ground pressure, and we're really looking forward to this being something that moves forward again this spring and summer. So ultimately, I wanted to leave as much time as possible for questions, so I sort of sped through that. But the goal here is to introduce the concept, plant some seeds on, is it possible? Yes. Are people interested? Yes. Are there opportunities to facilitate farm succession, access to new landowners? Yes. When you can get a turnkey site and be paid essentially a stipend to manage vegetation, is that bankable? Farm Credit, Farm Service Agency would probably say yes. That is something, if there's an ask from this presentation to CMAP and those watching this, it would be ask questions to the USDA and Farm Service Agency and NRCS. We are right now having discussions with AgriSolar Clearinghouse, they're a resource for all things agrivoltaics, with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Department of Energy, with joint conversations saying, how do we make solar available, agrivoltaics available, and not just lose those 10 million acres of land? How do we encourage folks, solar developers, to move in this direction? And then can we move them even further into regenerative practices, no-till, cover cropping, and then thinking about the nutrient density of food and getting it to more impoverished areas. That's the future. So if we can, in this community, if we can have that conversation, be open to those conversations, perhaps write a letter or two to the USDA saying, we would like, the NRCS to honor standards and specifications underneath these solar panels. We would like landowners to be able to still qualify for Farm Service Agency loans, conservation stewardship program payments on land that was otherwise be occupied by these panels, if it's farmed and legitimately so. So happy to kick it off for any questions from the audience, and this is our contact information. I don't speak for Jesse too. We're happy to entertain questions after this.
Great, thank you so much. We already have a question in the chat
Yeah.
from Meg. It says, Jesse, can you speak to what you needed to do to prep forage for sheep in an existing solar array? Did you for better forage?
Yeah, it's a great question. The short answer is I have not done that prep on any of the arrays I'm grazing so far. I am hoping to do that on a few of them. The array that's in the background behind me is out here in Gill. It's on a hayfield. The two arrays in Fitchburg that I showed pictures of in the presentation, those were orchard, but they had a good existing stand, primarily of orchard grass and clover underneath. Those arrays, the impacts of construction, I think they really pretty much disappear. If you have good existing sod of a hay or pasture type species, the construction related impacts will be gone within a couple of years. That's just, we have frost and the ground frost heaves and freeze thaw cycles. That ground will loosen back up on its own naturally. There was no decompaction done on any of these sites. And as you can see, they're really productive just as is. I do graze a couple of sites that were either partially or fully forested before they were converted to solar. Those are a lot less productive. And those are the ones that I'm hoping to do, basically overseeding inside of. I have about 8.5 feet of clearance. In the picture behind me, you can see there are some equipment boxes mounted on a post at the back of the system. Those are string inverters and DC combiner boxes. Those are pretty typical. And in the array that I'm most eager to reseed, it's about 26 acres. It was formerly forest. It's a lot tighter together, and the clearance between the rows is really tight where I have to go around those combiner boxes. So I'm hoping to find, when I've done overseeding on pastures at the farm, I've rented the no-till drill that Cheshire County RC&D has just over the line into New Hampshire. That's going to be really tight to fit through the arrays that I'm currently grazing. So until I can either get NRCS funding and enough solar companies interested in doing a lot of acreage so that we can, buy and finance it, or until I'm able to find another one that I can use on a rental basis. For now, I'm just sprinkling clover around when I'm out there, but it's actually the clover takes pretty well. It's getting better orchard grass in there. That's my highest priority.
Great, thank you. So I do have a question. I know there's a lot of people who are concerned that agrivoltaics will make land prices jump even more for farmers. So if some farmers are tempted to put it into solar instead of selling their land, that's definitely a fear that I've heard from a lot of farmers. I mean, southeastern Mass land prices are so incredibly high right now. It's hard to compete with developers. Do you
Yeah.
see that farmers are going to be competing with agrivoltaics to access land? Like this is going to be more of a land grab?
I would, Jesse, let me take the first step. I would actually say the opposite, the exact opposite. Conventional solar, houses are the last crop. If it can be developed, if it's an upland, it's pricey, right? It is land is going quickly. That's residential development. Conventional solar is an alternative to residential development. And if it can be grazed the way Jesse's showing, conventional arrays are a good alternative. Agrivoltaics, when a project is actually permitted for agrivoltaics, you're basically guaranteeing that for at least the next 20 years, it has to be farmed. It has to be farmed. So it opens up all, that's why I'm saying from land access perspective, maybe the existing landowner, maybe the existing farmer is the farmer there, but what is their age? In over 20 years, 30 years, 40 years of their lifespan of these panels, there's going to be transition. And there's going to be an ability for new people to come in with a turnkey operation that is requiring them to be there.
Yeah. The other thing I would add is probably we all know how challenging it can be to do permanent farmland protection. The APR program has really slowed down pretty dramatically in how active it's been in the past several years. And that's partly economics, that's partly funding availability, and it's partly programmatic policy issues. Out here in the valley, in the Connecticut River Valley, we're seeing protected land values over $10,000 an acre, $14,000 an acre. That's not primarily driven by anything other than large commercial farm operators buying land for agriculture. So when we talk about land access, I guess it's a question of affordable, for what purpose by whom. And as Ian was saying, I really see a lot of potential for folks to get long-term dedicated access to agricultural land through agrivoltaics rather than the counter. And to be honest, I've sort of run the numbers in BlueWave, when we're negotiating with a landowner about leasing a property for agrivoltaics or for any kind of solar, you sort of run the number on like, what's the value of the property? What is the lease revenue over 20 or 30 years going to look like? I have yet to see a property where we're talking about decent quality agricultural land in an area that has a non-agricultural development market. I've yet to see any situation where the lease revenue is enough to pay for that land. In combination with some kind of permanent, agricultural preservation, maybe, but that's, as a policy matter and as a funding availability and as tax credits for conservation, that's not something we've been able to figure out how to do yet. So, there's the concern about loss of land from agricultural use. I absolutely understand, and I particularly understand in the case of dairies, where the loss of 1 or 2 additional fields from a corn silage base for a dairy could be really, really impactful. It's really important that we're careful about that and acknowledge that. But I think there's a lot more potential to use agrivoltaics to secure land for ongoing farming, and in fact, to require agriculture. Than the opposite. Farmers may perceive that land gets lost to solar, that folks lose a hayfield to a conventional solar array. I'm not going to say that doesn't happen. It has happened. It has happened a lot. But I think the question I have is, was it a loss from ag or was it a loss from residential development, right? That field was lost from ag. It was a question of what was it going to go to? And if it went to conventional solar, it's not ideal. It would have been better if it went to agrivoltaics. But if it can be grazed or forage can be harvested, that's a whole lot better than a warehouse or a subdivision.
And as an example too, I mean, you can, and Jesse knows these numbers because this is a BlueWave project. You get a 100-acre field and the farmers, tenant farmers saying, geez, can you squish 40 acres of solar on this area over here and leave me the 60 acres to just farm unimpeded. You could do that. That 60 acres is still very susceptible to development, which in all likelihood would go that way in some future time in the next 10, 15 years. Instead, if that could be, the solar could be spread out and more space be allowed to do corn or another commodity crop because of the distance between the panels. And it could be 60 feet, it could be 120 feet. And it encompasses all.
I've got that slide. If you will give me the screen back, I can show people the project you're talking about.
Let's do that.
All right.
And while you're bringing that up, what percentage of solar arrays are actually agrivoltaics in Massachusetts? Do you
Statistically, we're at about 0.
Oh, okay. Because all the solar arrays that I see around where I live are deserts.
Yeah.
So what's the different levels? Because you're talking about that you are grazing a traditional solar array, so it wasn't meant for that.
Yeah.
So what's the difference between, the solar array that's in my town that is just kept like a desert versus the ones that you're able to graze? Is it
it's
on them?
Yeah, there's a couple of factors. One is what was the what was the condition of the soils and of the vegetation before the solar array. 2 is what did the installer or the company that hired the contractors to do the installation, what were their goals? Were they trying to minimize their mowing costs because they weren't anticipating using it for grazing or something? A lot of those solar arrays, even if they are on pretty good soils, will be seeded to what they call a standard solar mix, which is primarily creeping red fescue or sheep fescue, which is low, slow growing, unpalatable crap feed, to be perfectly candid. And that's a design problem, not a solar problem. And so to the extent that we're able to either reseed those arrays, and I'm working on reseeding a couple that have that kind of forage in them, I hope to at least this year, or from the outset get agrivoltaics, even if it's just grazing in a conventional array, get that included as one of the goals right up front. And so you either preserve existing forage that's there or explicitly seed it down to a good mix. The mix that BlueWave specifies, and I tell people, if you don't want to put a whole lot of time and money into developing a custom mix, Ernst Seeds out of Pennsylvania has a mix they call Fuzz and Buzz. It's designed for sheep and pollinators. It's primarily, it's going to work great. And it's going to, it's not the best pollinator mix on the face of the earth, and it's not the best pasture on the face of the earth, but you can specify it in a design and a contractor can buy it, get it installed, it'll work. And if you're trying to coordinate multiple parties on doing a project like this, that kind of like viable, doable outcome is what you're looking for. Some arrays are on old sand pits, and if you're in Southeast Mass and you're in like the sand plain area, like it's hard to establish vegetation there, period. Right? If you're able to maintain fertility and maintain your soil carbon, it can be very productive land. But if you lose that soil carbon and you lose that fertility, it takes a long time to get it back. And a solar company is not going to, absent somebody wanting to farm in there and some incentive money, they're probably not going to do that. We're seeing, I'm sorry, I'm going on. I stole the mic from you, Ian. I want to let you go back to explaining the array if you guys can see it.
Well, yeah, and I'm cognizant about the time. We have 3 minutes. I think, John, do you have a question?
Yeah, I had a quick question, but if you want to finish your thought, go for it.
All right. So big picture is when you look at these numbers, when you spread out those panels, it actually is less impactful to the land and agricultural use. It is sequestering or preserving that land that is otherwise suspect to development. So if you can preserve 105 acres of prime farmland through spreading these panels out, it's a great land preservation technique. That's ultimately what I was trying to say. Okay, go ahead, John.
Yeah. Hey, Jesse, Ian, great presentation. Thank you so much. There's a lot to digest here. I I'll start off by saying I don't necessarily have a question in mind, but I just wanted to sort of fill you in on a project that we're working on. So I chair the Agricultural Commission here in Taunton, and there's a property that's owned by the city. It's about 15 acres. It's a former farm that, you know, folks have reached out to me to try to preserve it. And the mayor administration is very much, you know, pro-development. And pretty much the only way that we could preserve this property and not have the city just sell it to the highest bidder is to figure out some way to generate revenue. So it's either you sell it for house lots or figure out some way to generate revenue. And as much as I tried to convey that, you know, agriculture itself could generate revenue for the city, probably not, but the solar seemed like the best option. So we have a developer that is willing to work with us, that's basically willing to donate an array. And they're sort of now working with the city to sort of figure out the logistics of it. But I guess just generally principles wise, it seems like designing an array that has a lot of flexibility for future uses seems like the best sort of principle, you know, not sort of pigeonholing yourself. I just generally speaking, for like a public agency, the city of Taunton, that's trying to do something like this, general principles that you think would be useful for us as we're sort of just starting to design what a city-owned dual use array might look like.
Well, real quick, TMLP, like how about them saying, look, we want to check all the boxes, the ESG boxes, and we are in our next 2 gateway communities. Let's embrace that. If we can open, they just have to comply with the requirements that MDR has, or the state Department of Energy has, for the height and the spreading out. So the shade calculations that Jesse showed earlier. But if you can do that, which, you know, is not rocket science to do, it may negate the donation of the panels, but it may not. It's certainly something to have a conversation about, and be happy to, and especially since it's municipally owned power company, and especially since you have Senator Pacheco championing what he champions, it just is a natural fit there.
The very short answer I'd give to you is spacing. It's about the width between rows. The more width between rows, the more equipment that you could fit through there, the more options future farmers will have. I worry more about width than I do height. It's a quibble I have with the Massachusetts program. The Massachusetts program is very fixated on height and shade levels. You can't drive a machine through the posts no matter what you do. So it's just more important to have more space between the posts.
Thank you both so much. And Ian, just to your point, TMLP wants to limit it to a 60 kW, which is like, I think their interconnection size. It's a little bit above my head, but yeah. I may reach out to both of you as well. So
the best scenario for agrivoltaics, just real quickly on that point, the best scenario is where the interconnection is smaller. The available interconnection is smaller than the acreage. That lets you spread out the system and have more land that's more agriculturally viable in the system. So if they're saying a really small system, great, just spread that sucker out and farm in there.
Thank you so much, guys. This has been really informative. If you don't mind, if you could drop, I know you put it on the presentation, but could you drop your contacts in the chat just so people can link those up? That would be fabulous. While you're doing that, I'm going to share my screen. Oops, not that one, that one. So thank you everyone for attending our conference today. We want to keep the conversation going, and we want to do it in person. We have 3 networking events coming up this March and April around the region. The first one is going to be March 21st at Bristol Aggie. We're also going to have one at Norfolk Aggie, and then we'll have one in Plymouth as well to follow. We've got a virtual skill building workshop. The next one is on March 22nd, getting up to speed on farm spreadsheets. So this is an online workshop about how to better use Excel spreadsheets on the farm. We have an exciting lineup of our on-farm farmer-to-farmer twilight event. So our farmer-to-farmer Skillshare. They're going to start in April and go all the way through October. So keep an eye out for those topics. We're starting to put them all together and they're looking really great. Join our newsletter if you're not already a part of it, and keep an eye on our calendar for those. So if you fill out our survey, you get a choice of special prizes. You can get a CMAT hat or tote bag, or you can choose to get a 10% off your Johnny Seed order, which is always really exciting for me. So fill out the survey and you can get one of those gifts. And it won't take more than 10 minutes. Here's a link to it. We will be sending out all the recordings to all the different talks and all the different resources that go with them. They'll come out next week by email. I want to thank everybody for coming today, and I've done a lot of learning today, and it's been really incredible. So thank you to our speakers. Thank you to everyone who came. If anyone has any questions, let me know. If not, hopefully I will see you all at the networking events in person.
Thanks for having us, Susan.
It was great, Jesse. I really liked it. Thank you, Ian. Awesome.
Take care.